Welcome to the India Fintech Diaries, the only podcast focused exclusively on the Indian fintech market. I'm Elroy.
And I'm Hemant. In each episode, we dive into the latest trends, ideas, innovations, business models, and personalities that are shaping India's fintech landscape.
We also invite amazing guests who are innovators and industry players that are driving the change that is helping make financial services more modern, innovative, and inclusive in India. Come join us as we explore the changing landscape of fintech in India. Welcome back to India Fintech Diaries, the show where we discuss all things Indian fintech. I have with me my co-host Hemant. A few weeks ago, we began a new series where we looked at investments and investing in Indian fintechs. Today, to discuss this topic further, we have with us Melissa Frakman, CEO and founding partner of Emphasis Ventures or EMVC. Welcome to India Fintech Diaries, Melissa.
Thank you, Elroy and Hemant. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Melissa, it was great meeting you in person at Money 2020 over at Las Vegas. I hope you had a great time at the event. How was the vibe at the event? Talk to us a little bit about your impressions.
Oh, the vibe was great as always. Every year I attend Money 2020 and catch up with my colleagues and friends in the US Fintech ecosystem. And to be honest, there was less of a focus on Asia or India than previous years.
Okay.
Everybody was really focused on sort of US banks, and it was a very US centric scene. Yep. But it was great to see everyone, and so great to see Zita really featured prominently. All of us in the Indian fintech ecosystem were very proud to see that, and excited to see lots more companies from South Asia come to the US.
Melissa, you've been associated with India for over a decade now, with a particular emphasis on investing in India. Talk to us a little bit about yourself and how India happened.
Sure. So I have been working in India now for 17 years, and there's an expression, third culture kid, which I think summarizes how I am well, which is that I'm Canadian and American and live in New York in the US, but I'm equally comfortable in India. I started my career in the mid 2000s in microfinance, working with MFIs on the ground, which is where I learned Hindi and ended up studying at IIM Ahmedabad. This led me to working with global companies such as MasterCard, MoneyGram, NCR, Remitly as their product lead and advisor on navigating India, including participating in early rounds of what are now kind of the household name payments companies in India. I became closely involved in policy making, including leading industry groups in payments, wealth management, banking, and having opportunity to be the fintech point person with RBI, Finance Ministry, DIPP, even Prime Minister Modi's first visit to the US, and worked with US Treasury Department and White House in their bilateral work with India, and took on operating roles including Zomato, which included how they were thinking about restaurant and merchant payments globally, and international expansion in the years leading up to the IPO. And so over the years, I was advising exceptional Indian startups that were vastly underappreciated in the global market. And Emphasis Ventures, EMVC, grew out of our work serving as the bridge between US, international, and Indian brilliant minds, sort of building the future of fintech.
That's extremely impressive, Melissa. It really gives us a lot of perspective on how you've been associated with India over the years. I would also want to understand your views on how Indian fintech has evolved over the last decade. You must have had a ringside view to the whole journey as well.
Yeah, I mean, not only ringside view, but frankly, I feel privileged that the timing of my career was alongside the timing of India developing as a global leader in digital finance. And the reason why I'm so committed to this, honestly, for my entire life, like we're very long-term investors with a multi-decade view on this, is that I've seen that this is still early days for all the development that have happened and all the exciting things that have happened that you talk about on your podcast. There is still so much more to come. So in terms of, it's hard to summarize an entire ecosystem briefly, but I would say, there's always been deep financial services minds in India. And even since independence, sort of India has grown really interesting, solid banking institutions and legacy financial institutions and a relatively robust equity markets. Over the years in the 90s, post-91 liberalization, there started to be sort of more foreign investment into insurance, into global Indian banks. and otherwise, and further development of the Indian public markets. And it was only in the sort of early mid 2000s that the tech talent, deep tech talent of the IT sector in India that was booming sort of started to move toward, building in financial services. And we started to see the early movers on mobile wallets and payments and kind of fin ops in terms of how large companies do their operations. And then obviously, fast forwarding, there was major developments on financial inclusion where India and Bangladesh were absolutely global leaders on what's possible for microfinance and leveraging credit and bank accounts and moving the underserved into the formal financial ecosystem. And then fast forwarding to all of these things were sort of underway. It was already very exciting. If you're interested in this period of time and you're younger, you could read something like Raghuram Rajan's 10,000 Steps that talks about sort of the financial reforms they were thinking about in those era. And then obviously we get to Modi and we get to the year of demonetization and GST implementation, which just was this tipping point that everything was already there and the innovation was already there. But it accelerated, I think, what would have happened over 5 or 10 years into a year in terms of consumer adoption of payments, as well as digital adoption of micro and small businesses. And since then, it's just been a wild ride, very rocky in the week to week terms, but up and to the right in terms of innovation and development in the ecosystem. And things are really flourishing. I mean, my global peers at venture funds can't believe that we're fintech focused in India and see thousands of companies.
Melissa, you have been involved in US and India, two of the most vibrant fintech ecosystems. And over the years, we have seen a strong transition in themes which are running our most prominent ones. So in the last few years, if you could talk about what are the most interesting fintech themes that you have seen emerged in US and India. And earlier, I think in some way, India themes were following what was in US, started with payments and then lending. But now we are seeing also companies emerging very much solving very India problems with Indian talent focused on Indian consumers. So if you could just shed some light or your views on the key themes that you see in both US and India.
So I'd say, it makes sense to kind of contrast them first. The US has honestly simpler regulatory framework for startups. It's much easier to just get a startup up and running and raise initial money through a safe note in the US. And clearly larger monetization opportunities for fintech startups, being able to charge different kinds of transaction fees, MDR, all those things. And then obviously ticket sizes for transactions are higher. So companies that are targeting either, payments or AUM or deposits have sort of more to work with, if you will.
Yeah.
However, in my view, India is ahead of the US on these things with higher consumer adoption. Like the average Indian in a tier 3 town somewhere is much more digitally savvy about how to use payments on their phone than an equivalent person underserved in a tier 3 city in the US. India has faster iteration of innovation and sort of moves faster in terms of trying new things. Definitely faster payments. I mean, real-time payments are unheard of in the US right now. And then obviously a deeper infrastructure with the open architecture of, everything, Aadhaar, eKYC, UPI, etc., to support innovation that is being just talked about. And actually the CFPB in the US announced an open banking framework last week, but it's very early days and it doesn't exist in the US. Both countries have sort of a diverse customer demographics within the country, like from state to state in both US and India, your customer preferences and the way they engage with fintech will be different. Both have a government that is interested in encouraging innovation, and both have legacy banks that have terrible apps that need disrupting. I would say that the common themes across both countries, to really zoom out to the 10,000 foot level, would be access, expanding access. Digital finance has always been available to the top 1% in both countries in many ways. And expanding the convenience and benefits and low cost nature and delight of using fintech products for consumers out into kind of lower in the economic pyramid is a theme in both markets and continues to be. Digitizing insurance and the way risk is managed is still an early theme in both countries that hasn't even hit its tipping point, in my view, very early days. Both countries have a lot of a theme is sort of bringing tech into the capital markets with different kinds of robo-advisory, wealth management, RIA models for digitization. And then both a very sort of hot theme right now is infrastructure and how you build the architecture in between consumers, businesses, banks, reporting, etc., to make financial services completely seamless.
Understood. Melissa, now focusing on two leading questions from what you just explained, primarily on the B2C side, there is a view emerging that, right, everyone wants to target the top 1% of the Indian market because the emerging theme or view is that running a profitable fintech is pretty much only possible with the top cream layer of the customers. Now, since those are limited and everyone wants those customers, acquiring them is becoming increasingly more expensive as more firms vie for it. So what's your view on this emerging dynamics?
I mean, and that would be true, by the way, to your last question in US and India as well. I mean, the marketing fits if you're targeting sort of urban, already digitized, already using fintech customers is very high. And I would add, because I love thinking about this stuff, that there's also in both countries a changing demographic where the users are younger and sort of more internet native. And so the kinds of marketing needed for these users and for these products and even to reach businesses is going to be changing, both in the India and the US. I would say to that common view that people like to talk about how it's impossible to make money in sort of the mass market in India, that there's some truth and some laziness in that. It's obviously very challenging in a market where for a business to really succeed at scale, it has to have mega volume and scale, and then sort of low margin and scale in that way. Obviously, there's inherent challenges in that, but I also think that that's the inherent opportunity. I mean, the very nature of innovation in India is solving for the local market. And we have seen businesses be able to build very large, lasting businesses serving the mass market in India. They are fewer and farther in between, but I am still bullish, and Emphasis Ventures will continue to invest in companies that are working on bringing innovation in business models and revenue models, not just in technology, to be able to build sustainable business for the last mile.
Got it. And the follow-up question, Melissa, from that, now, if to win in the market, there is one option to go through the cream layer where the cost of acquisition has become higher. Second option is to go behind the mass market, but where you need massive volumes, which would require at an initial stage good amount of funds or deep pockets to go through it. And considering that the Indian funding environment seems to be shifting where more money is now flowing through to the more mature firms than the earlier stage company like earlier. So do you see in the future the entry of barrier, which was much lower when it comes to fintech startups, is going up, and the number of fintech startups starting up and growing fast would start becoming slightly more difficult in the country than earlier?
Honestly, no. I think that there will always be entrepreneurs that see problems in their backyard in markets all over India, sort of micro markets, ready to innovate and build companies. And I don't see this current, perhaps fleeting trend within the venture space in India affecting the propensity of the entrepreneurial spirit in India to not start exciting companies and products. I do think that there's also more global capital and investors looking at the market and understanding how important the kind of inclusion, access, big scale businesses are. And so I think the trend you're describing in capital will also be offset by other investors coming in who understand that. And two, I think that how India is extremely fast-paced, the tech sector and especially the fintech sector, and things change very quickly. So what's true today might not be true even in 2 quarters from now. But these are massive kind of generational challenges that deserve people building in them who have sort of a generational system changing outlook and shouldn't be at the whim of like quarter by quarter funding trends.
I think a lot of what you're talking about, Melissa, is also kind of echoed in the statistics. So very recently, BCG put out a report that put Indian fintech growing at about a 20% CAGR. And in the last 5 years, it's gained about $29 billion in investments, or as a larger share as 14% of the global fintech investments. But if you look at more recent quarters, right, funding's actually shrunk to just about $815 million. And the average ticket size has also plummeted by almost 58% to about $15 million. So I just want to get your views. How does this funding crunch actually affect fintechs, mainly in the short term? Because in the long term, I think the future is definitely bright, but the short term is definitely going to be challenging.
So I can speak from our portfolio that rounds that have a lot of interest and align with themes that funds already are looking at, especially generalist funds that are not sector focused like us, are still getting closed at great valuations for the founders right now. And I would say generally, other rounds that are underway or happening are still closing, just at moderated valuations from where they were 4 to 6 months ago. And perhaps they're taking a little bit longer to raise. But I don't see at the early stages, sort of pre-seed to Series B in India currently, that there is of a crunch or that it has really affected kind of the top quarter of startups in the market.
I think that's great to hear, Melissa. And also, I think it's a great time to segue into EMVC. Talk to us a little bit about your fund and what kind of firms you look at investing in. What's been your funding philosophy?
Sure. So Emphasis Ventures, we go by EMVC, is a venture capital firm focused on early stage investing in the future of digital financial technology, insurance, and commerce in high growth global markets. And as we talked about, we believe that India is 5 to 10 years ahead of most fintech markets in the world. And therefore, we invest actively both in Indian startups as well as those emerging markets inspired by India. So the EM in Emphasis is a nod to how India as a digital innovation leader has already emerged, and following in its footsteps are another 50 emerging markets. We've invested in over 25 Indian fintech startups with an enterprise value now over 1 billion US in our portfolio, and serve as a hands-on partner to our portfolio on things like their global growth strategy, regulatory engagement, marketing, and of course, hiring with our work at a fintech platform. And then in the US, we are sort of hardcore evangelists and build partnerships for our Indian portfolio companies, which has led to some really exciting outcomes, some of which haven't been announced yet in terms of cross-border partnerships. So our funding philosophy is to invest in the best founders at the earliest stage possible. So we lead pre-seeds and participate in seed and A, with reserves to follow on for multiple rounds after that. And within fintech, we define it very broadly, everything from commerce enablement to insurtech to FinOps to sort of core mainstream fintech, if you will. And really excited about our long-term thesis about how India is inspiring the rest of the world on these things.
Melissa, when a fintech firm pitches an investment to you, what are typically the top 3 things you look for while making a decision to invest in that particular firm?
I'd say it's mostly founder. We're at the early stages for venture. We feel that it's entirely betting on the founding team and their ability to execute, because also part of doing business in India, and especially financial services, is that inevitably the market is changing quickly, which means the startups are agile and almost inevitably will pivot in some way during their journey. So it's mostly about the entrepreneurs. We look for people that are extremely sort of intelligent, but also kind of intuitive about their users, whether those users are individuals or businesses, as well as we look for a very strong sense of the market already. So if a founder is completely clueless about, the market they're jumping into, given the complexity level of financial services, how highly regulated it is, how much it involves deep partnerships and integrations with lots of players, everyone from a bank to all the various SaaS companies that you would need to integrate with, as well as the open infrastructure like UPI. It requires, we feel, business leaders that really already have a great understanding of that space. So those are the main things. We also like just creativity. We think that India is exceptionally complex, and therefore it requires a bit of sort of genius and creativity to really cut through the noise and build something that is system changing and legitimately changes the lives of users or consumers. And so all of those things are among the top that we look for.
Great. Melissa, to just add a little more color to what you just spoke about your portfolio, it would be great to hear about some of your star investments and what was your hypothesis that you had while investing in them.
Well, I like to consider that they're all stars.
Of course.
Of course.
So it's hard to pick, but I will, for the record, these are randomly selected kind of thing. To talk about a few. An example of how broad we look at fintech would be our portfolio company Clinic, CLINIK,
Okay.
that we feel like is taking on the very audacious and very challenging, ambitious goal of reforming basically access to healthcare and health insurance in India. So beyond a distribution platform for digital insurance, they've figured out through their years in the medical industry, the founders are both a surgeon and an engineer, that the real, impediment to access for Indian financial services is costs. And the only way to really reduce costs is change the way healthcare is delivered. So Clinic is building both, India's fastest growing digital health insurance product, but also physical clinic in a box that actually does 80% of primary healthcare for its subscribers. And companies like Ola are partnering with Clinic to offer it to all of their drivers. So that's really exciting and an example of what I just described, where it's bold and creative. And we think those are the kinds of solutions that are required for India. Another example would be Katabook, where we think Ravish and team have built something extremely localized for Indian context. It's not a company that would have popped up randomly in many other places. And the way they've been able to grow from their initial virality, launching the Katabook product, which of course digitized the Kata that was already, very ubiquitous across all kirana shops and SMEs, into something that is now the operating system for literally millions of MSMEs in terms of how they engage, advertise, work with their consumers, figure out inventory, etc. And how much financial services you can deliver on top of that is extremely exciting. And another example of something that's system changing. Our portfolio company Bureau, which is based in Bangalore but has a very global outlook, is leveraging learnings and kind of operating best practices from engaging in India on being a fraud identity risk solution for emerging markets, internet first companies, and using sort of their India presence and again, how strong a product has to be to serve businesses in India really well to go global. And they already have customers all over the world using Bureau as a fraud and risk solution based on sort of how significant its innovation is relative to its peers in the US and otherwise.
Got it. Melissa, very interesting. And just based on the breadth of the ideas just you spoke about, that illustrates that the definition of fintech that you take up when you say that EMVC is fintech focused is a very broad definition to say if there is a problem which can be solved by a combination of financial and technology, basically financial prowess and technology, that would be something that would be very keen and interesting for you.
Exactly. Right? It's cliche to say everything is fintech. In part, we believe that, but also this layer of how finance happens that enables any commerce to happen around the world is of interest to us. And again, we really lead with an India-centric view of the world, where we think there's a lot of global solutions and best practices that can be learned in India for other markets. Just one more example is our portfolio company GramCover, which is India's largest and first mover digital insurance brokerage for rural India. We get inbound outreach from insurtechs across Africa and somebody in Uruguay and Mexico saying, we'd love to learn from GramCover about how we can do digital insurance in rural markets in our countries.
True, Melissa. GramCover is pretty impressive. I've also gone through them, met them as well. But yeah, absolutely brilliant idea. Melissa, there's one thing that is now spoken about much. I think India is leading in that as well, is that we have got a very hyperactive regulator in all the areas, right? Whether it is IRDAI or RBI and everyone. Of course, they are working because I think digital is expanded to people in the nooks and corners of the country before financial literacy could reach there. So the digital has reached first. So the consumption has started, but literacy may take some time. And regulator wants to make sure that they are taken care of. Having said that, that also creates a bit of uncertainty when it comes to investing in Indian fintechs. So how are you handling that kind of risk which now exists in the environment?
Rather than hyperactive, I might say enthusiastic.
I think that's a better word. That's a better word to use. Yeah.
Look, I sincerely have a lot of respect for the RBI and Finance Ministry and SEBI, honestly, in India and IRDA. I think that while sometimes they can be a bit heavy-handed in their approach to implementation of rules, particularly as it affects early startups that don't have the resources to comply and pivot quickly, I think that the spirit behind the policymaking that's happening is mostly very good. The regulators are not out in India to hurt business. They're there to, a lot of the policies that the fintechs are talking about right now have the spirit behind them of consumer protection and preventing very marginalized communities and users with very low disposable income from getting hurt in the market. However, what we as a fintech industry, and particularly what earlier stage fintech companies need, is just more transparency and predictability in the rulemaking. So with a more consultative process, more kind of heads up and forewarning for circulars and stuff that's coming down the pipeline, that would solve a lot of the current challenges that fintechs are talking about in India. And so, for me as an advisor and partner to our portfolio companies, I tend to think it's all good. And part of this is just honestly doing business in India involves engaging and being ahead of the curve with the regulator and policymakers. But I do think that more of a consultative approach and pulling together more founders to go talk to regulators and it not be such a black box will be a step in the right direction to solve some of these surprises that have happened recently.
Absolutely. That makes sense. And Melissa, now to bit of crystal ball gaze a bit. Where do you think the Indian fintech is heading in? I think 5 years is too long, as you rightly said, but maybe in next 2-3 years.
I mean, I'm bullish for 5 and 10 years also. Again, like I said before, Anand Mahindra once said, which I think is perfect, that India is a blurry picture, but a beautiful movie. And I think that's true for the fintech ecosystem as well. Within the next sort of 2 to 5 years, I think that we'll see much deeper and wider operationalization of things like the account aggregator stack, Oken, the e-commerce stack, and much kind of broader UPI penetration in last mile areas, which includes more fintechs integrating with those platforms. I think that there'll be more kind of further digital lending rules that come down the pike, and therefore kind of a change in how NBFCs and fintech lending happens, perhaps in a bit more of a conservative way, but companies will build and adjust to it and continue to scale because the credit demand for both businesses and consumers in India is absolutely massive. I think we will see consolidation in segments like wealth tech and payments, where some of the larger players, both growth stage and the large corporates, will bring in some innovation from the early stage companies earlier. And then I think Indian legacy large businesses across sectors will start to modernize a bit more, like the very old school sectors, like manufacturing, if you will, as an example, leveraging sort of the SaaS and fintech that exists in the market. And then, as I mentioned before, I feel that there will be a different look and feel to the UX of fintech products, especially on the consumer side in the next 5 years, given a much younger, kind of savvier population with different aesthetic preferences and user preferences coming online, right? We're seeing all the trends for credit cards, debit cards just skyrocketing. So the penetration of cards within 3 to 5 years will be much more.
Absolutely. And Melissa, it was clearly visible because the amount of usage on credit card and debit card was off the roof during this Diwali. So amazing and good Diwali for all our financial or fintech companies. So on that very positive and optimistic note, I would like to thank you. It was amazing speaking to you. And Melissa, if our listeners or the founders who listen to us want to reach out to you, what would be the best way to do that?
Sure, I would be thrilled to engage with your listeners and always happy to brainstorm with people building or thinking of building and wanting to just brainstorm around solving for fintech problems in India. You can email us at hello@em.vc, as well as follow me on Twitter, which is my name, so at Melissa Frakman, or at EMVC. And feel free to DM us there as well. We're on all social media. We also are launching an internship fellowship program soon for younger folks who want to get deeper into India Fintech, and would love to hear from folks on that as well.
Excellent. We'll include all those details in the show notes. Thanks once again for coming on the show and spending time with us, Melissa.
It's a pleasure and great to be here. Thank you again.
That's it from India Fintech Diaries for this week. Do log on to our website, indiafintechdiaries.com, for exclusive content. We also cover fintech deep dives in our Substack newsletter, so do subscribe. Until next time, mask on and stay safe.